everyone. Welcome to the January edition of the CanNRT Research Forum series with today's session titled Challenges Linked to Online Survey and Bots in the Collection of Disability-Related Data. My name is Eliana, and I'm the Training Program Manager at CanNRT. So for those of you who may not really be familiar with the Canadian Neurodevelopmental Research Training Platform, CanNRT is a collaborative training hub that supports research excellence and sustainable and equitable pathways for early career researchers in neurodevelopmental conditions across Canada through multidisciplinary cross-sector learning, mentorship, and connectivity. And one way we do this is by bringing the CanNRT community together in such forums, which showcase the diverse work of our members and promote collaboration and knowledge exchange on topics related to neurodevelopment and associated conditions. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that CanNRT headquarters are located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. This land has been a place of meeting and exchange between indigenous nations for a long time, including those of the St. Lawrence Iroquoians and the Huron-Wendat and others. I would now like to introduce today's moderator, Ms. Kelly D'Souza. She's a master's student in educational psychology with a focus on inclusive practice and research, studying at McGill University, and who's also a TAC trainee co-lead, who would lead us through this forum and introduce our wonderful speaker. So thank you everyone for joining, and Kelly, the mic is yours.
We are very honored to welcome Dr. Mackenzie Salt as a speaker this afternoon and to have the opportunity to learn from his research, expertise, and lived experience. Dr. Mackenzie Salt is an assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral neurosciences at McMaster University and a research associate at the National Center for Autism Collaboration. As an autistic researcher, his work is grounded in lived experience and deeply connected to community needs. Through his research, Dr. Saul Mackenzie brings attention to the voices of autistic adults, helping shape national policy and research practices that better reflect the realities of those they aim to support. An alum of CanNRT's predecessor, the Autism Research Training Program, Dr. Mackenzie Salt is now a member of the CanNRT Steering Committee, actively contributing to program leadership, teaching, and networking activities. His long-standing commitment to improving quality of life for the autistic community continues to inform his collaborative national work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mackenzie Salt.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Eliana. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Just an update on, that was a great bio you read there, Kelly. Thank you. Great intro. So I am an assistant professor at McMaster University, and I am a research associate at McMaster University and Autism Alliance of Canada. And today we'll be talking about the challenges linked to online surveys and bots in the collection of disability-related data. Before we get started into the presentation proper, I want to acknowledge the funders of the projects we're going to be talking about in this work. So CIHR, the Israeli Foundation, MyTax, Public Health Agency of Canada, and the Pathways in ASD study. And then also the research that will be presented here is affiliated with Autism Alliance of Canada, McMaster University, the McMaster Autism Research Team, and Hamilton Health Sciences. So to begin, we're going to talk a little bit about definitions. So a lot of us have probably heard of bots. In a more formal way, we're going to talk about bots as automated scripts or programs that pretend to be human and complete surveys with false information. And then another word that gets talked about a lot in this sphere is bad actors. And this is a term that's actually falling out of favor. I think it has a useful definition here that isn't quite covered by scam participant, which is what it's usually replaced by. But bad actors are people who act to undermine research directly or indirectly, though not always through participation. So the person behind the programming of the bots, I would consider to be a bad actor per se. And then we have scam participant. So this overlaps with bad actor, and it's people who knowingly participate in research fraudulently. So they know they're not eligible to participate in the research, but they try to pass as if they are, usually by providing false information or limiting the information that they share. So Research has increasingly moved online since the COVID-19 pandemic started, and this has led to increases in accessibility in research. It can provide for better accessibility options. Um, it can provide a larger reach than the traditional in-person research, and it can create less logistical issues sometimes. So it depends on participants' comfort with technology, but it can create less logistical issues than in-person work. However, this has also led to a proliferation of bots, bad actors, and scam participants. Now, it's important to note that this is not domain specific. There is research going back several years in not only disability research, but also sociology, anthropology, computer science research, psychology. It covers a wide variety of fields. But surveys can be particularly vulnerable and uh, for a number of reasons that we'll get into, but surveys, one of the reasons surveys can be particularly vulnerable is that you don't necessarily see it coming until it's too late. Um, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but I want to focus a little bit on how disability research is uniquely vulnerable to bots and bad actors and scam participants. So one of the reasons that and a lot of the reasons why disability research is vulnerable to fraud, and to be clear, bots, bad actors, scam participants, this is fraud. It's participation fraud. Um, and the reason it's vulnerable to fraud is that one of the things, especially in I do autism research, in autism research, we aim to be flexible. We aim to be accessible. And so we don't necessarily have as rigid protocols as we might have for in-person work or that we may have had in years past. We want to be more cognizant of our participants' comfort, their needs, any support they might need to participate. And this can decrease the scrutiny that we might be able to or think about doing um, of people looking to participate. No one ever wants to um no one ever wants to have to think that, oh, is this person really disabled? Is this person really a member of this community? It's not a comfortable question to ask. It's not one you want to ask. um but it's a question that with accessibility and flexibility we don't have the same sort of checks and balances that we might have had with in-person work. So using alternative arrangements, for example, allowing someone to participate with a camera off or with using an online avatar, which are accommodations that I've seen used in autism research, this can allow for the anonymity that scam participants use to be able to participate. As well, targeted recruitment for specific underrepresented groups can attract bad actors, especially in cases where they won't necessarily be participating synchronously. For example, a survey. If you're looking, for example, for autistic women in a research study, and you don't have any sort of um, other criteria than just filling out a survey, what's to stop someone from just saying that they're a woman to fill out a survey, or saying that they're autistic and a woman to fill out a survey, especially with compensation. So when we think about equity in research, there's a lot of talk about how for years in research, we didn't necessarily researchers didn't necessarily compensate for surveys. And there's been a lot of talk in the community about how we really should be compensating for surveys, and especially with um, some of the groups we work with in terms of autism research, for example. Autistic people are underemployed or unemployed at much higher rates than people with other disabilities or non-disabled people. So there is a strong moral and ethical impetus to compensate. However, that compensation can attract attention as well, especially if it's, oh, I fill out a survey, I get a $20 gift card. I don't have to, like, am I really part of that group? Does it matter? Can I just fill out all these questions? So also self-reported diagnoses can increase the risk of fraud. So when you there are some studies that have looked at including sort of checks on sort of research that asks for medical documentation and things for eligibility, may have far lower rates of fraud. So not checking for that literature or not checking for that paperwork and such can increase the risk of fraud. But I think the key to this all is, and this sounds a little bit bleak already, and I'm only 6 slides in, but as researchers, we also have a duty to not reinforce stereotypes about people faking disability, but we need to balance the rigor of our study with also not disproportionately adding barriers for legitimate participants, because the harder we make it for scam participants, the harder we make it for legitimate participants as well, and this creates problems. So there's a lot of subtlety involved. It's very individual when you get down to it. So in terms of bots specifically, previous studies that have been affected by bots have advocated for both prevention and elimination measures, so prospective versus retrospective measures. And most of these measures fit into the following categories. So there's metadata measures, survey design measures, inconsistent data measures, and suspicious activity measures. So metadata refers to things that the computer will log. So things like IP addresses, completion times, things that someone doesn't necessarily have an influence over outside of technology. Survey design, how is the research designing the survey? What features are they doing to try and prevent bots from manipulating the survey? Inconsistent data, is the same question being answered differently at different time points within the same survey? Suspicious activity, are there a ton of logons right at the same time? These are all things that we can look at. So I'm going to talk about my experience with bots, specifically in the context of the Canadian Autistic Adult Needs Assessment Survey. It was a national survey of autistic adults aged 30 plus years old. It was done online via Qualtrics, though we had paper and phone options. It was a 97 question survey covering 11 areas of life, so a very substantial, meaty survey. And because of that, we offered $20 compensation per participant in terms of a digital gift card. It was a bilingual survey, and it was open for 2 months. And it was advertised via emails, social media ads on Facebook and Instagram, and general social media posts on X, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. So some of the survey design elements that we included to try and avoid or mitigate the issue of bots were a 2-step opt-in process. So we had a consent form that people would read, and then they would put their email in and say, I want to receive a link to the survey. And then once we had that email, we could then send out the link to do so. So they first had to go read the consent, and then instead of going right to the survey, they have to submit their email. And we changed it after we noticed bots were becoming a problem to ask for a little bit of additional information as well. But this way, there were opportunities for additional checks. It wasn't just, okay, I've read the consent, I'm clicking, I'm getting in the survey, I'm having free reign with the survey. So they submitted their email saying, I would like to receive a link to the survey, and then individualized links were sent out to them via Qualtrics. And we added bot logic questions to this later on in the process. I'll talk about them a little bit later. They weren't as effective as I'd hoped they would be, but they were used. We had a CAPTCHA test in the survey itself. We did not have a CAPTCHA test in the original opt-in sheet because we did that through Microsoft Forms, and Microsoft Forms does not support CAPTCHA. So, which it would have helped, but in the survey itself, we did have a CAPTCHA test. We also had relevant ID. So for anyone who's used Qualtrics before, relevant ID used to be their way of detecting bots and fraud, and it was a largely hidden algorithm that would look at factors including IP address and other things to give a score, saying how likely something is to be a duplicate of another entry, or how likely something is to be fraudulent. It would also identify attempts at ballot box stuffing. So that's the same person trying to go in again and again and again to fill out a survey. And however, I do not believe it exists in that form anymore. I was talking to a colleague last week, and they said that all the relevant ID stuff had been removed from the Qualtrics platform, and something else was in there now. So I don't know how relevant this is to Qualtrics today, as it was when it was used. We also added a honeypot question 5 days after launch when we realized that we had an issue. And a honeypot question is a question that is programmed into the survey, but it cannot be seen by the user. So it's in the code of the survey, but it's not actually visual on the screen. So it was an innocuous question of how did you hear about this survey? And it gave a bunch of different options. So if it was filled out, it was immediately flagged, because the only way someone would see that is if they were going through the code. And that's usually what bots do, is they scrape the code of the website or the survey. And this was touted as a good strategy for identifying bots. It isn't anymore, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So I want to go through the timeline. So the survey originally launched on June 19th, and we started the meta ads on June 22nd. As you can see on the chart, there's a huge spike on the 23rd. So we had up to 135 signups an hour at some points, which we had almost 1,400 people sign up on that day. On June 26th, we changed the ad campaign slightly as per Meta. So we had approached Meta saying, look, we have a problem with signups. We're concerned that some of these are not legitimate, and they suggested changing the ad campaign. So making sure that our ad only ran during sort of awake hours in specific time zones. So not having things run at 3 a.m. Eastern time in Quebec or Ontario, as those can sometimes attract bots. And then after that change, the bot activity died down a bit, and then it spiked again on July 22nd. And then we added additional bot questions to the sign-up form on July 31st. And part of the reasons for the delay was getting ethics approval in the interim for changes with the study underway. Although I will say that the ethics board was incredibly responsive once they realized what was going on and how quickly things were moving. And in the end, we had 15,296 signups to receive a survey link. So this is more than we could have ever hoped for. So a month into the survey, as you could see from the chart, we knew that there was a problem going into it. I did not expect this type of response. So about a month into the survey, myself and my team, we started reviewing the data for anything that stood out as odd beyond the Qualtrics tags. First of all, there was an inordinate amount of unexpected answers. So almost 32% of the responses identified themselves as being Indigenous, but only 5% of the Canadian population identifies as Indigenous, and we did not have any specific Indigenous outreach or partnerships with Indigenous organizations. So that struck me as odd. Also, over a quarter of our respondents said that they lived in remote or isolated communities, which again struck me as extremely odd. And there was other inconsistent information. So people saying that they lived in BC, but their first language was Quebec Sign Language. It's possible, but it's still a little odd. Um, or people saying that they lived in a remote community, but they put a postal code for downtown Toronto. So at that point, we knew we definitely had an issue. So one of the issues was we were not as prepared for this as we had hoped. I had talked to a couple of other people who had faced issues with bots, but it was on a much smaller scale. And some of the things they suggested were things that I used, like the two-stage opt-in. However, the consent form was very vague on the identification of bots and what to do in case someone was identified as a bot. So the consent form was changed to more clearly reflect that people who are identified as bots may not be compensated. And the ethics board asked that everyone sort of re-opt in who had filled it out at that point. So a reconsent form was sent out to previous participants, and due to email server limitations, had to be sent in batches. I could only send 500 at a time, and the response to the first batch was mixed. The responses that I got were either strongly negative, including threats of lawsuits and other sorts of intimidation, or they were positive. There were a number of people who said, "Hey, I'm an academic. I get it. Bots are a problem. What do you need from me? Can I help?" Which was really heartening. Um, and so with help from the REB, a different letter was sent out, allowing people to instead opt out at that point. And one of the things we found was more people responded to the reconsent form than it had been sent to. So 573 people were sent the reconsent form, and 285 people reconsented who had not been sent the form. So again, things did not add up. And I was looking in the research literature, I was looking at websites. There was not a lot of information at the time publicly about this. So my team and I were pretty much on our own. Oops, I jumped a little bit. So we had to make some changes for sure. So as I mentioned before, Microsoft Forms does not support CAPTCHA. I wish it had. I added 2 questions to try and eliminate bots on July 31st. And there was a cultural logic question and a numerical logic question. So the numerical logic question was, what is a number between X and Y? And there was a specific whole number that would go in the middle. And we had, so in mine, it was, what is a number between 34 and 36? With the answer I was seeking being 35. And we had some cheeky responses like 34.2 and things like that. So we accepted those, but only 75% of sign up, or sorry, not 75%, 75 signups period failed that question, the numerical logic question, and also 75 failed the first question, the cultural logic question. So the cultural logic question was, tigers are understood to be orange with blank stripes. And the answers were orange, black, blue, and green. With the answer we were looking for was black. A lot of people who failed said orange. And that can be a sign of a bot reusing words from the question in the answer. One person, or sign up attempt, I should say, it may not have been a person, failed both questions. And then one person failed a question, but also asked for a survey link anyway. So they had failed the question and then emailed a few days later being like, hey, where's my link? I'd like to fill this out. So, but they did have an email signature indicating that they were an autistic person who did speaking engagements and things like that. So we sent them the link. So less than a quarter of our total signups happened after making the changes in the sign up process. So I'm not sure if that's a sign that making the changes to the sign up process helped, or if they had just gotten bored at that point. So in total, for those of you keeping track and interested in numbers, we had 15,296 signups for links, and we sent 14,908 for the difference there of just under 300. We did not send links to those because we identified them early as bots, for example, with scam email addresses that didn't make sense, or other conflicting information that they provided. And 8,220 people started online surveys, with 7,871 having finished them. And the reason for that difference is the surveys, each individual survey link was open for 2 weeks. Because we knew it was a long survey, we wanted to give people time to fill it out. So being able to fill it out, put in a few things on one day, take a break, go back to it another day, and having to complete within 2 weeks. Many of the ones that were not finished were on the very last question and had not been clicked through to submit it. And I would think that part of the reason for that is that these were bot masters that kept it open so they could sort of go back and try and sort of test different routes through the survey to see what was more or less successful when they were programming their scripts. And then we had 41 people who completed phone or paper surveys. We also asked people if they wanted to be compensated. We did not make compensation mandatory because some provincial disability assistance programs claw back income benefits for people based on receiving gift cards for research and things. So we gave people the choice. And for those who wish to be compensated, there was an additional compensation form that collected personal information to be able to send that gift card out. So we asked for name, email, address, phone number, and then a compensation code that was linked to the original survey. So at the end of the survey, they would self-generate a code, and then they would put in that code again for the compensation form so that it could be linked up and prove their participation. And some information was inconsistent. And that is an understatement. So we had compensation codes that were wildly different. Lots of people put in compensation codes that didn't exist. We had addresses that did not link to physical locations. We had some that led to empty lots, the middle of intersections. We had email addresses that didn't match the name or any other feature that we could find. And then we had phone numbers for international countries, for the United States, for all over the place, or incomplete phone numbers. Lots of phone numbers only had 6 digits. Or it was just numbers that had the first 2 digits being 555, which is traditionally used in television to create numbers. So we started with trying to figure out, okay, who can we disqualify immediately? Who can we get rid of immediately? Because we've got a ton of people to go through. So those who failed the honeypot question, of which I believe only 7 actually failed it. So as effective as it may have been in the past, it really wasn't anymore. Those who failed the screening, so the screening was just a couple of simple questions about are you autistic? Do you identify as autistic, or are you diagnosed, or are you not autistic? Are you older than 30 years old? Do you live in Canada? What is the first 3 digits of your postal code? That sort of thing. So if they failed the screening, they were out. If their age was under 30, some people did originally say, yes, I'm 30, let me into the survey. And then when asked for their age, they would put something like 22. And so we had to take them out of the survey. And then ballot box stuffing, which was a tag by Qualtrics of people who had tried multiple times to fill out the same survey. So then we had to look at, okay, what do we have left? We have thousands of things left to go through. How can we make this easy? And it wasn't, and it wasn't easy. But we started by looking at the compensation form, because that provided the most thorough information that we could find. And we figured that most of the bots are probably there because they're probably doing it to get the gift card. So We looked through the provided information and came up with a list of potential indicators, which are called flags, of a bot or a bad actor or scam participant. And these flags were organized into tiers, and the number and tier of flags dictated whether an entry was likely legitimate, likely a bot, or if we were unable to tell. And we called those borderline responses. And the goal is to remove as many bots from the data while minimizing the chance of accidentally flagging a legitimate participant. This is a group that has not been included in research as much as it needs to be, and we want to make sure that as many legitimate voices were heard as possible. So, and we had limited information to work from. So we used the information we had to try and decide on the balance of probabilities, is this person more likely a bot than a legitimate person? Or is this entry related to a bot or a person? And this was cleared with our ethics board. They were the ones who suggested the sort of likely to legitimate, likely bot dichotomy to work from. And so we end up with tiers like this. So this is math with colors. So yeah, this was a little hard to come up with. We sort of planned it very much like a video game would, of like different tiers of difficulty and things like that. So if you had one red flag, you were instantly marked as borderline and you would receive additional scrutiny. If you had one red, if you had one red, you could have up to 2 green flags as well and still be borderline. So all of these flags were bad. They were just different types of bad, potentially. So so green was the least bad or the least suspicious. And then it went up to red. So red and pretty much anything else apart from green, if they had more than one flag, was considered a bot. And then we had orange, so 2 oranges meant a borderline, 1 orange and 2 of any other also equal borderline, 1 orange and 3 of any other would be a bot, and so on. So we had we created this tier list. It was myself and 2 others on the research team, and we spent 3 weeks, the 3 of us working together to come up with the flags to look for, the tier, and then organizing them into tiers, and then figuring out how that would work on our side to identify those entries. So some examples of the different colors of flags. I'm not going to go through all of them. If you had relevant ID duplicate scores of 80 plus or fraud score of 30 plus, these were suggested thresholds by Qualtrics. If they had reconsented to the survey without actually receiving an original link, then they were given a red flag. If they had if there were multiple entries with identical starting and ending times, if they had identical starting times and duration to other entries within about a 10-second duration, then they were given a red flag. If they used a lot of person-first language in in 6 qualitative questions that we had, if they used person-first language or other specific terms that we looked at and said, actual autistic people probably wouldn't say these things. So person-first language was one of them. Writing in the third person was another one. Talking about autism as a disease was another one. And then if they were younger than their diagnosis, that one was pretty straightforward. So if they said they were 30, but they were diagnosed in their 50s, then that got put in the red flag pile. And so as you can see, these things can add up because you can have multiple of these things true at any given time. Orange flags for things like survey duration under 10 minutes. When we piloted this survey with autistic lived experience partners, we had the fastest time they got was about 30 minutes. And the median completion time we had for the survey was about 45 minutes. So anything less than 10 minutes was immediately suspicious. If they had a CAPTCHA score under 0.5, if they had identical starting times, claimed to live in a remote area but had a postal code for an urban area, duplicate address or phone numbers, that sort of thing. Yellow flags include email addresses with no vowels. That one was strangely consistent. And then postal codes that didn't match the province they lived in. If their survey duration was under 20 minutes. Green flags include name does not match email. So a lot of emails we had were first name, last name, and a string of numbers. So we would have something that would say John Smith 987, but the person would write their name as like Samantha Brown. It's like, okay, John Smith email, Samantha Brown. Okay, that seems weird. If they indicated that they use sign language, but they didn't indicate a sign language under their languages used, just inconsistent information in general. And when we were doing the mitigation, different levels of information became an issue. So for those people who didn't wish to be compensated, we didn't have a lot of that additional information to work from. We could only go from what their surveys said. So we only had the metadata and the inconsistent information flags. So we couldn't deal with things like address, phone number, or anything like that. So for those who requested compensation, 21% were identified as legitimate, 5% were borderline, 72% were bots, 2% were disqualified, 2 were duplicates, and 21 entries withdrew. For those who were not seeking compensation, 70% were legitimate, 24% were bots, 1% were disqualified or were identified by the honeypot question, and 3% were screened out. So overall, you can see that when you don't ask for compensation, the bot rates go down. The fact that we had 24% bots in that group was a little surprising, but we put it down to the fact that maybe they went through and just were clicking random questions to see, and they went into the do not receive compensation string of the survey as part of their experimentation. So as we went through it, we still had borderline ones to figure out, and we weren't sure what to do about those. So we reviewed them once more in detail. We especially looked at qualitative responses and comparing other details within their entries. And this revealed a pattern of batches of responses where multiple surveys with similar durations within about 1 to 3 minutes submitted in sequence with extremely similar demographic information. And so this allowed us to help work through some of those borderline cases, and any responses that we were still unsure about. The 3 of us discussed it until a consensus was reached on how to mark them. So from the borderline responses, this actually led to a couple of different things. So 199 responses that were originally classified as legitimate were changed to bots. And this was due to the duplicate flag on Qualtrics. If you have, let's say you have 6 entries done in a row that are all identical, the first one is not marked that way because it's not a retrospective flag. The subsequent 5 are, but not the first one. So we ended up finding 199 that sort of fit that issue, that they sort of started these batches and weren't tagged. And then we had 114 of the borderline responses were coded as legitimate and 239 as bots, based on our discussions and further scrutiny. So from the end of the survey until the data set was fully coded for invalid responses was approximately 7 weeks. So it was 3 weeks to figure out what we're going to do, and then another 4 weeks to actually apply the process and get the data fully cleaned and ready for analysis. So yeah, it's a big time commitment dealing with bots. In terms of the results, we had 1,912 legitimate responses, including 41 paper and phone surveys. One interesting fact here that I think is particularly relevant: none of the French entries were identified as bots. We applied them to the same algorithms, but there were no French entries as bots. So it is possible that bot issues might be more relevant to English than other languages, but I'm not going to say that that's for sure. But in this case, none of the French entries were flagged by our algorithm. invalid responses, 6,000. And that includes those coded as bots, screened out, disqualified, or withdrew. And that's almost 76% of the participants. And then an email went out to 5,201 respondents who had requested compensation, but who were identified as bots, and it gave them the opportunity to contest this with a Zoom call with their camera on. So 2 people asked to opt out of compensation and allow their data to be used without verification. However, we still didn't use the data because they still flagged as bots. And then 23 responded negatively or otherwise. Again, more threats, more talks of lawsuits and things like that. Insulting behavior and more. And then 5 requested to verify their identities. 1 was legitimate. So 1 was legitimate. He was using, his computer was programmed to use Apple Privacy Tunnel, which got flagged because VPNs get flagged under the relevance ID system with Qualtrics. So, and that was his only flag. And so he explained it. He showed us his address, and so so he was legitimate. We met with 1 other person who he wanted to verify, and every time we asked him a question, he looked off to the side as if he were reading a script, and the answers he gave did not match what he gave in the survey. And then the other 3 refused. They all wanted to meet at different times, none of them in Canadian time zones. 1 of them actually came to the meeting with the camera off, refused to put their camera on, and once they were asked difficult questions, they left the meeting and never came back, and I never heard from the other 2. So I'm guessing all 3 were the same person trying to be 3 different people. So talked a lot about bots. Let's talk about scam participants. So in the Autistic Definitions of Adulthood study, which is currently in its analysis phase, we were doing a focus group study looking to recruit autistic people aged 16 to 29 years old, and then 30 plus years, to ask them about their experiences and views on adulthood, milestones, and such. And so we recruited from a consented contact list from previous research participants, including those from the Autistic Adult Needs Assessment Survey, as well as online postings. And these postings were with advocacy organizations. They were not with social media. We avoided social media afterwards, as we felt that that was one of the reasons why we got hit so badly with the bots. 272 people wanted to participate. 24 scam participants were identified by inconsistent information that they gave, and they were excluded from the screening. And some of them were in the consented contact list from prior research. So it's important to consider that if you are creating contact lists from your research, if you get bots or scam participants in, they might become they might continue to be an issue from that list. So sometimes it's good to review that list if you can, and compare information if ethics will allow you to do so, to see if the information they gave your list matches the information in the study. 2 participants who were selected for screenings were identified as scam participants and were not allowed to participate. So they actually got through the screening process, and it wasn't until after the screening, but before participation, that we identified their fraud status. In both cases, they looked extremely bored on camera during the consent process. And I know consent forums are long and they can be boring. But one of the people had a lot of American memorabilia in their apartment that we could see from their Zoom. And when they provided a phone number for contact, it was a Texas phone number. And so they were excluded. And the other person similarly gave mismatched information that didn't survive scrutiny. So I want to talk a little bit about recommendations. I know we're coming up to the end here. Really plan ahead. Bots are an issue. They are going to be an issue. They could potentially be an issue. Have something ready for that. So for the 2-step opt-in, it's more labor intensive, but in the case of the Autistic Adult Needs Assessment Survey, 46% of signups did not start the survey. So that's a huge bunch of potential fraud that got sorted out, that got filtered out before it got too far. CAPTCHA and other bot detection in the opt-in and survey, if possible, if you can compare the scores. I know that some other platforms, I know Microsoft Forms still doesn't, but I believe RedCap will allow you to do CAPTCHA as well. And if you can use RedCap for both your opt-in page and your survey, you can do the CAPTCHA twice. You can compare the scores, and that can provide you more information, because here more information is key. Track IP addresses. I did not do this. The ethics board had concerns about wanting to track IP addresses. So I decided not to do it. The advantage to using Qualtrics was their relevance ID works behind the scenes. So while it does include looking at IP addresses, I can't see that. It's not information that I have access to. And so track IP addresses if you can. I know that another survey that I worked with, whose lead is actually here in the audience, the PanCan's autism survey, they used tracking IP addresses, and it made a big difference. Don't make your personal phone number available. I made that mistake. According to my text message log, I'm one of the most wanted people by the CRA and all other sorts of scams. I get scam text messages on a daily basis. Never do that. They will fill, if people are angry, they will fill your phone with spam. When cleaning data involving fraud, determine a goal with the guidance from your REB. This is crucial. And if there's one point you take away from this, it's this one. When we did the cleaning of our data, we looked at what is the most likely result. Is this likely a person or likely a bot? Does that mean the data is completely clean? No. But I can take comfort in the fact that we did not, of the 6,000 people, there were potentially only 3 that were false positives for being a bot. So that says to me that the algorithm is fairly robust and minimizes the chance of identifying a person who is a legitimate participant. Because when you're dealing with autistic people or other people with disabilities, they may think differently. They may answer differently. They may answer in a way that you don't expect. And it's not that any one particular question got someone booted out as a bot. It was the cumulative of multiple questions that were important. So some studies in this space looking at bots have focused on data purity. And and in some studies, they got rid of probably legitimate people, even noting that in the work, but saying they wanted to make sure if they had even a slight suspicion that they could be a bot, they got rid of them. And ethically, I have a problem with that. So we have to accept that sometimes there may be some fraud and such, but we want to make sure we get most of it, as much of it as we can, while preserving the legitimate views and perspectives that we need to hear from. Ask for the same information in different ways in different parts of the survey, not on the same page, because that's easy to be consistent. So for example, in my survey, we asked for the first 3 digits of the postal code on the first page, and then by page 6, they're asked for which province do you live in. So you can match the postal code to the province and see if there's inconsistency there, as an example. Set answer orders variably, so you don't always have the most positive or most likely response listed first. So in the questions about remote or isolated areas, as well as Indigenous ethnicity, for the ethnicity question, the Indigenous options were listed at the top, and then the rest were listed in alphabetical order below. So if you're just clicking around and you're just clicking the top answer every time, yeah, it's going to look a little strange. For the remote or isolated communities question, it was, do you live in a remote or isolated communities? And it was yes, remote, yes, isolated, or no. Most common answer would be no in Canada. So, but that was the last answer on the list. So if you're just someone just clicking the first answer every single time, then that's going to be a way to identify it. And then look at qualitative responses for impersonal language. Again, language that people in that community wouldn't use, or talking about oneself in the third person, or we had people talking about or entries that said, we asked about how does your diagnosis affect your life in terms of employment, and they would answer, autistic people have difficulties with employment on a broad basis. And it would go into this whole paragraph, and it was probably something from ChatGPT that someone just copied and pasted in. And also consider other compensation mechanisms. So we had someone who approached us partway through the survey and said, hey, I don't know if you know, but your survey's been hacked and I've got proof, but I'm not the hacker. I wouldn't be that guy. And then they sent a screenshot showing an inbox with 22 identical emails from our survey. So they had multiple emails that were forwarding to a central one. And they said, you know, if you put a physical address and sent out physical cards, this would cut down on this. Which, when we looked at addresses from the compensation form, we had a lot of addresses that didn't exist. But you need to have those addresses if you're doing physical gift cards. So physical gift cards might be a way to go. The other option is do a lottery or draw, and the PanCan's autism survey I mentioned earlier used this approach, and they had a 3 times lower rate of invalid responses than this survey did. In dealing with scam participants, have language for dealing with these issues in your consent forms. So for example, something like participants who are found to have misrepresented themselves will not be compensated for participating and their data will not be used. This in itself can scare off some scam participants. And then always have a synchronous screening component, so you actually know who the person is. See if their information matches what they've given you. And again, check for disinterest or lack of participation in those screening and synchronous processes. Check participant information at every step before participation, because sometimes you'll leave it and someone will go through multiple steps and then they'll be ready to participate and you haven't looked at it all. But then once you look at it all, you see, oh boy, there are a bunch of flags here. This person might not be the people that are eligible for this study. And then ask about common experiences faced by the population being studied. And Elizabeth Pelicano suggested this in one of her papers. So in her study, she was doing qualitative interviews with autistic people and focus groups, and she found that there are some people whose stories about their experiences of being autistic didn't add up to what she'd heard before and what was in the literature. And it turned out she later identified them as scam participants. And overall, just be vigilant. So I know I've thrown a lot of scary stuff at you, but there is hope. Like bots, bad actors, and scam participants are becoming a perennial issue for researchers who are doing research online, especially those who focus their work on disabled peoples or people with disabilities. Online research has created more options for researchers in reaching people with disabilities, while also helping to address accessibility needs of participants. But as the technology gets more sophisticated, such as with AI, there will be more potential for these previously mentioned types of fraud to occur. So as researchers, we cannot bury our heads in the sand. This is already happening. Don't say to yourself when you're doing your own online search, oh, this couldn't happen to me. It can happen to anybody. And so we need to acknowledge that risk, and we need to plan ahead of time and have mitigation strategies in place. Thank you very much.